Okay guys, we are ready to add some color to our foreground, middle ground, and background. So I have my watercolor paints here. I've already activated them by placing a drop of water in each one. I suggest having at least 2 different brushes, probably a paper towel, maybe a clean tissue, and having those available to you if you need them. Okay, so let's talk about the first thing I'm going to do. I'm really going to walk you through my thought process here and my decisions and why I'm doing this, okay? Of course, you can make adjustments to your artwork to make it more your own. That's fine. I do want you to take into account some of the things I'm saying and attempt to use some of these ideas in your own artwork. Okay, so the first thing I want you to see is that when we open this up so that it's the full page, it looks like this. So if you've done this correctly, at this point, you're not going to see the drawing of the house here. All right, so you'll see the foreground and you'll see the background, but the middle ground is facing away from us. If your paper does not look like this when you lay it out, you've done it wrong and you're going to need to go back and make that adjustment, okay? So that's the first thing you want to check. The next thing I'm going to do is I am going to start with my background. So we're going to be focusing on this section of the painting first. So we know that one way artists can create depth in their artwork is through the use of foreground, middle ground, and background and overlapping. They can also do it with color. So I'm going to be using colors that are more in the cool range, so colors that might have undertones of blues or purples in them to help create the feeling that my background is farther away. So let's look at what I'm talking about with that, okay? So I'm going to bring my paints over here, and I have cleaned the top of my paints off, and I do recommend that you put a placemat or a piece of scrap paper under your work while you're painting so you're not ruining anything at home. Okay, so I'm going to start by mixing up my color for my background. Now, if you want this to have more of a bright sunny day feeling, you may want to choose a different color of blue than what I mix up. I kind of want it to be a little bit gray in mine. So I'm gonna start by adding some brown, actually, just a small amount. You can see just that tiny amount really changes the color of that. Now I'm gonna keep mixing until I get the color I want, but I'm sticking with my blue and brown for the time being. Okay, so that gives me more of a moodier blue, a darker blue. And if you want to try it on a scrap paper to make sure you like it in advance, go for it. I'm just going to go ahead and paint this onto my paper. Okay, so I would recommend that you probably start with a medium brush for the bigger areas and then switch to a smaller brush as you move into the larger areas. If you don't want your paints being really watery, you want to make sure that on the side of your water container, you're gently pressing that against there to get some of that extra water out. And make sure your brush is clean before you use it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and paint this in. So I didn't want a distinct line there between my 2 blues, so I took my brush, which still had some water and some paint in it, and I used that to bring that down. So I'm starting by doing the outline of the tree. Then I'm going to go back in with my brush, this larger one, and pull some of that color up and out. So you notice me switching between my 2 brushes. I actually hold both brushes in my hand while I'm painting. You don't have to do that, but that just allows me to switch back and forth between my 2 brushes quickly. I don't always do that, but I do it pretty frequently. if your sky in your background is not one consistent value, that is not a problem. In fact, it may make your sky more interesting and potentially more realistic, because when we look at the sky, it's often different shades of one color. Okay, so don't worry about it if you have some areas that are a little bit darker and some areas that are a little bit lighter. That's not going to be an issue. Make sure that when you mix up whatever color you're using, that you err on the side of making too much of the color. Nothing worse than running out of what you were using. But again, if you do, it's not the end of the world, because having different values of a color in a painting, especially in the background in the sky, could make your work more interesting. You do want to paint your sky the whole way to the ground. Hopefully at this point you know that. I still see so many children, students, young people who stop their sky before it hits the ground. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we are going the whole way down. Okay. So the reason, again, I'm doing this darker blue, kind of this moodier blue in my background is, one, I like darker colors. I like bright colors too, but I'm drawn to kind of these moodier blues, and hopefully that will help the background seem even further away in our artwork. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and let that dry for a minute, and I may make adjustments to it. I'm gonna try something out and see how it goes. I'm gonna take a tissue and on my clouds, we'll see if this works. I'm just gonna dab a tiny amount of that same blue so that my clouds aren't staying 100% pure white. So I'm just kind of dabbing that in on there. I did end up getting my tissue just slightly damp. So you don't need to cover every bit of white on the cloud, but that's going to add some value and even some texture to that. To make those clouds a little bit more interesting. Okay, so obviously this is wet. We know that when something is wet, we do not want to paint anything that's touching it. Right now, there is nothing left on here that I can paint until this dries. So what I'm going to do is I am going to move on to my foreground for now. And be careful with your paints, because if your placemat or your tissue picks up paint like mine just did, it's going to get on there. So let's talk about how to address that when that happens. You're going to take a wet brush, a clean tissue, and you're going to blot that off to the best of your ability. I would not rub it, because if you rub it, it will likely tear your paper. Okay. So it may not take it off perfectly. Accidents happen with watercolors. They're unpredictable, but usually it's not the end of the world. It's definitely not going to make it so that you would get an F or a grade that would not be passing. So don't worry about that, okay? All right, so dry off your area, wipe it clean, and let's take a look at the foreground now. So if we're using cool colors in our foreground, what we want to focus on cool colors in our background, excuse me, what we want to focus on in our foreground is the use of warm colors. So that doesn't mean I'm going to paint these bushes orange or red. but what it does mean is that I'm gonna work some warmer tones into the colors I'm using. So if my bushes are gonna be green, which I intend to make them green, then I'm gonna start thinking about what color I'm going to add to that green to make it a little bit more warm. So I'm gonna be using yellow in there to add in some warmth to my work. So I'm gonna make sure my brushes are really clean. And you're gonna wanna start with your lightest green first for this. So I've already mixed up for a different project. I was already using yellow green, but it's here, and I'm just gonna reuse that. So I'm adding some water to reactivate that paint. And that was just a lot of yellow with a touch of green in it. You should know how to make all of these colors from our practice with color theory. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and paint in these bushes with my yellow green, and I will probably come back in here and add some values on top at some point, but I'm gonna start with my yellow green first. Okay, I'm gonna stop when I hit that line. So if you don't switch brushes, you're going to want to hold your brush really upright to get in those smaller areas. Okay, and right now I think I'm going to actually use some yellow green in this area as well. So I'm going to stick with the color I've been using, and I'm just going to paint that the rest of the way down. And then I'll go back later and add more color in to make it more interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna pause here for a minute, and I'll be back after this dries. I'm gonna give it 5 to 10 minutes to dry, and then I'll come back and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so the foreground is still just a touch damp. I'm gonna let that continue to dry. But my background is feeling pretty dry. I'm just gonna double check. If it feels wet to you at all, I would let it dry a little bit longer, or use a blow dryer with parental permission to help move the drying process along. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and move this over, switch my paints over to the other side, and I'm gonna continue to think about my colors that I'm using and thinking about the use of cooler colors in my background. So I'm gonna do something that might seem a little funny because I just mentioned cool colors. I am going to work a little bit of a lighter green into my trees. So I'm going to start with my trees, and it's not going to be super yellow green. It's going to be darker than what we used in the foreground, but it's going to have a tiny amount of yellow. So technically that's more of a warm color, but we are going to be layering on some cool colors over top of that in our tree, or at least that's my goal. Okay, so I'm just gonna go in here and just paint in some areas of the tree. I'm not gonna paint the whole entire tree in using this. I'm just trying to create a little bit of depth in my painting by layering some colors here. So you can think about where the light would be hitting on the tree, probably along the edges and the top. And I'm just gonna go in and pop some color in. Okay, so that was really fast, pretty easy, and already you can see how it gives the tree more form. meaning it's less flat. It looks more three-dimensional. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing over on this side, focusing more on the tops and the edges here. Just kind of like I always tell you with my pencil, I just wiggle my pencil. I am literally just wiggling my brush around. And I'm going to leave the area where it's overlapping. I'm not going to put very much of this yellow-green because there would be a shadow because they're overlapping. So focusing more on the edge and the top here. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry for a minute. I'm going to clean this up. And I'm going to move down into the grass. And I am going to use that same green I just mixed up to just kind of go through down here. I'm going to focus this color more towards the front of my paper, or the foreground. I guess the bottom of my paper is what I should say, not the front. I'm always making these videos either early in the morning or later in the afternoon when the coffee has either not kicked in or has worn off. So okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and let that dry, and we'll see about maybe adding in some more green here in a minute once that's dry. I'm gonna wipe off my placemat. And shift back to my foreground. Okay, so this feels pretty dry now. I'll move my paints over here so hopefully you can see what I'm doing. All right, so I've got this down. So I think the next thing I'm gonna do is I am going to start with my brown and paint my path in. Now you could do your path a different color. I'm going to use brown for mine. And I'm going to be adding a little bit of yellow to my brown. So I already had some yellow orange in there. I'm just going to leave that and I'm going to mix this together. Okay. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus this lighter, warmer brown towards the bottom of the paper. And again, in watercolor, we do a lot of layering of values, and I always tend to start with the lighter colors first, because you can't really paint over the darker colors with lighter colors and watercolors. So you want to start with your lighter color first. So the reason, again, if you've forgotten, the reason I'm hopping between the two sections of my paper is because I have to give the watercolors time to dry. So if I don't give them time to dry, I'm gonna get some nasty bleeds, and that's not gonna be fun. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and let that dry, and I'm gonna check back on this side and see if anything over here has dried. So if it's not dry, give it a little more time. I'm gonna go ahead and work into the tree with some more green, because it's not the end of the world if it's not dry there, because I'm just gonna continue to use variations of green in there. Okay, so I'm gonna go in with, this is just the green straight out of the paint palette, and begin adding this in some places. So I'm gonna do some layering. You can see where the colors are overlapping, it's creating other values. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and use that same green in through here. Okay, I'm going to let that dry. And I'm going to check over here after I wipe off my placemat. I'm going to walk or head this back over to the foreground. Okay, so I am now going to add some of those same values that we just used in the background to the foreground, but I'm going to use them a lot more sparingly. And I'm going to stick with kind of a warmer green. So the green straight out of the palette's fairly warm. There's quite a bit of yellow in it. And I'm just going to think about areas where I might see a shadow. So, for example, underneath the bushes, there would probably be a shadow on the ground, depending on where the sun is in the sky. So I'm going to do a line there, bring in some of my water. This is not watercolor paper that we're working on, so it doesn't work quite as nicely. So if you have watercolor paper that you've been working on at home, you'll probably notice a difference. And then I'm going to blot this and pick up some of that green. I'm going back in with just a little bit of water to blend the color out just a little bit. Okay, I'm going to come over here and do the same thing. And I'm really going to take my time more on the foreground here, because when this is folded up, we're not going to be seeing much of this background. So I'm definitely being a little bit more intentional with where I'm putting the colors, the brushes I'm using, and how I'm doing things in the foreground. So again, I just came in there with water, and I'm just taking the brush and pulling out some of that color. I'm going to put a little bit under the rocks. Do the same thing, wet brush, just kind of pull that color out a little bit. Come over to the other side and do a little bit along the path here. All right, so now I can think about maybe going in and trying to add a little bit of those darker values into these bushes. So I'm gonna try this technique where I'm just getting a damp tissue, just like we did on the clouds, and I'm just kind of dotting that on there. Okay. I'm gonna go in with my brush. Just kind of blend those out a little bit, gently. This is not watercolor paper, it's thinner, so you have to be careful that it doesn't tear. So always be thinking about being gentle there. So you're getting closer to the edge, you've got to be more careful with the tissue. And again, going back in just with a wet brush to diffuse that color a little bit. then again, we can begin to think about areas on the bush where it might be a little bit darker. So, so probably as it comes down towards the bottom of the bush, it would be a little bit darker. Okay, so I've layered on that value. It feels like this is pretty dry down here, but because these are still a little bit wet in areas, I'm going to move back to the background and continue on that. Now, I'm going to encourage you to pause this video as needed and come back to it because this is going to be a process where you're constantly shifting back and forth, and it's going to take you a little while to complete. So if you need to pause the video and come back, go ahead and do that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move back to this side, and I'm going to attempt to work in some of my darker blue greens now. So I'm going to mix blue and green. I already had some blue-green mixed up here, so I'm just adding a little bit more green to it, and I'm going to go ahead and work that in now. So thinking about where some of these darker shadows in the tree might be, blotting this a little bit. Again, you don't want to cover everything, because if you go over everything, then you're going to lose the depth and value that you've already created in there. Okay, and then I'm going to come in here and work in some of my blue greens down here. Okay, we'll switch back over to our foreground. And this time I'm going to focus on the path. So I'm going to mix up some brown. This is just straight brown, actually. I'm not mixing anything. Let's see if I add anything to it or not. And I'm just going to come in from the top of that. And with just a wet brush, I'm pulling that paint. Okay, gonna let that dry, and I'm gonna hop back over here. Hopefully it's dry, and I'm gonna add in more of a I'm going to start with just the regular brown and add some blue to it, just a very, very small amount. I still want this to look brown, but I want it to be a cooler brown than what I used. ahead and let that dry. And check the foreground. Still feels a little bit wet. So I'm going to put some finishing touches in here. I'm probably going to have to come back to do that because it's almost time for me to teach you in class. Okay guys, so I've taken a break. It's the afternoon, everything's dry. And so my goal now is to finish up my foreground and background so that we can move on to the middle ground in the next painting. So I'm going to go ahead and work on these trees, which I'm not satisfied with. You know, you're welcome to follow along if you did a different project. Obviously, you're going to be using different colors and different techniques, but maybe some of these will apply to you. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and work on this tree. And what I really want to do now is add in some of those really dark greens. So I'm going to mix my blue and my green together. I'm going to add more blue to that. Really darken that up, and I'm going to add some brown to it as well. Remember, we're using cooler colors in the background to make the painting recede even more. Okay, so this is dramatically darker. Let's see what happens if I go ahead and pop that in some locations. So I am going to switch brushes, and I'm going to get that on there, and I'm going to think about the areas that would be most dark. Okay, and I'm going to take some of that darker green, and I am going to go ahead and follow along the bottom here. Okay. I think I'm almost about done with the background. I may just put a few spots in here, just a few more. Okay, and then I am gonna let that dry. So I'm gonna scoot this over and take a look at my foreground, and I see that I've got those little stones I need to paint in. So I'm gonna mix up let's do some gray. So I need to clean out a spot on my palette. So I'm gonna go ahead and scoot this all over. Okay, and we will add a little bit of black and some water. And we're going to paint in just the first part of the stones. finishing bits on my bushes. So I'm gonna go with just a slightly darker green. This is not gonna get super dark because this is the foreground. So I'm gonna add some green and just a small amount of brown. Okay. Go ahead and put this in just under here, and then also on the bushes. So I'm just using a wet brush to kind of blend that color out a little bit. There's no color on this brush, it's just water. Okay, and then I'm gonna go ahead and add in go ahead and let that dry. Shift back over to here, and I am going to just mix up a little bit darker brown for the tree trunk. So I'm gonna add my brown. And a touch of blue. Maybe a little bit more. Oops, maybe too much. Okay, wet brush. Just blend that out a little bit. No paint on it, it's just water. And then you're just gonna go ahead and continue to work on your painting until you feel that it's finished, okay? So this is pretty close for me to me feeling like it's pretty much done. My last thing I'm gonna do is just add a little bit more value to these little stones that are in the path. And then I'm gonna pretty much be done with my foreground and background. And once I finish that, I just wanna take a second to show you what that's gonna look like. I'm actually gonna use this same brown I just made for the trees, and I'm gonna add it to the stones because it's gonna blend in with this gray a little bit. And then I'm gonna use a tissue and just blot that and add some water to blend that out a little bit. Okay, I am just gonna let this dry. And then I'll be back to show you the middle ground. So before I go, I just want to show you this. So we have these two, we can see the variation in color. And then as you can already begin to see, when we have those colors that are darker and more cool, it really starts to have the background recede, make it feel even farther away, okay? So that's why we're focusing on the use of warmer colors, adding in those colors like yellow to our greens and things like that in the foreground, and then in the background, focusing more on those cooler colors. I may go in and add some more to my clouds or my background, but this is a pretty solid painting at this point. And that's going to be up to you whether you add anything more to it or not. Okay? All right, I can't wait to see what you come up with.